The scent of simmering butter and fresh herbs lingered in the air as Andre Simmons stepped into the grand kitchen of La Belle Cuisine, one of the most renowned fine dining establishments in the city. The kitchen was a well-oiled machine. Chefs moved with precision, plating dishes that looked like works of art. The clatter of knives against cutting boards, the bubbling of sauces, and the sizzle of meat hitting a hot pan created a symphony of culinary excellence. This was exactly where Andre wanted to be. But as soon as Richard Belmont, the restaurant's owner, spotted him, the air seemed to shift. Richard, a middle-aged man with a sharp jawline and an even sharper tongue, stood at the entrance, sipping a glass of red wine as he scrutinized Andre with an unimpressed glare. "You?" Richard scoffed, eyebrows raised. "A chef? I think you're in the wrong place." Andre, standing tall, gave a polite smile. He had seen this reaction before. Some people assumed black chefs belonged in barbecue joints or soul food kitchens, not in an elite French restaurant. He was used to proving them wrong. "Actually," Andre said calmly, adjusting his crisp white coat, "I'm exactly where I need to be." Richard let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Right. And I suppose you think you belong in my kitchen, cooking French cuisine?" His tone was thick with disbelief. "Tell me, what's your background? Some little diner? Maybe a food truck?" Andre felt the subtle insult, but he didn't flinch. He had been in kitchens all over the world, mastering classical French techniques, but he had learned long ago that his best weapon against arrogance was patience. "Something like that," Andre said with a smirk. "I applied for the chef position, figured I'd give it a shot." Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Fine. Since you went through the trouble of showing up, let's see if you can handle basic kitchen work." He gestured toward the back. "Start with preparation. Chop some onions. If you don't cry your way out of here, maybe I'll let you near an actual stove." Andre nodded and walked past Richard, entering the kitchen as if he belonged there, because he did. The other chefs barely looked at him. Some side-eyed him, whispering among themselves. A few sous chefs smirked, probably betting on how long he'd last. The head chef, Pierre, a stocky Frenchman with decades of experience, motioned toward the cutting station. "You, new guy, onion brunoise, carrots julienne, celery small dice. Let's go." Andre pulled out his knife. He took a deep breath and began chopping. Within seconds, the blade moved with precision, swift, sharp, effortless. The rhythm was flawless. Pierre, who had expected slow and clumsy work, raised an eyebrow. He stepped closer, watching. Andre kept going, cutting with perfect consistency. He didn't need to check his work. He knew it was right. When he finished, he stepped back. Pierre inspected the cuts. He picked up a perfectly diced onion, nodding. "Not bad." Then he picked up a julienned carrot, turning it between his fingers. His brows furrowed. He looked at Andre, then back at the cuts, then back at Andre. "You've done this before," Pierre said slowly. Andre just smiled. Richard, standing near the door, frowned. He hadn't expected this, but he wasn't about to admit that he might have underestimated the new hire. "All right," Richard called out, his voice laced with skepticism. "You can chop. Let's see if you can cook." Andre's smile didn't fade as he stepped toward the stove. Richard had no idea what was coming. The kitchen of La Belle Cuisine was alive with the sounds of sizzling pans, clinking silverware, and the murmured instructions of chefs in crisp white jackets. The air was thick with the aroma of rich sauces, fresh herbs, and slow-roasted meats. But for Andre Simmons, a world-renowned chef who had built his reputation on impeccable technique and innovation, the kitchen wasn't welcoming. It was hostile. And at the center of that hostility stood Richard Belmont, the arrogant and racist owner of the restaurant. From the moment Andre had walked in, Richard had looked at him like something that didn't belong, dismissing him before he even stepped into the kitchen. "You, a chef," Richard had sneered. "I think you're in the wrong place." Andre had held his cool, offering nothing but a polite smile. "Actually, I'm exactly where I need to be." But Richard wasn't about to let that slide. Instead of giving Andre a station on the line like the other chefs, he had shoved him to the back of the kitchen. We'll start you with something simple, Richard said mockingly, tossing a dirty apron his way. Dishes, let the real chefs handle the cooking. Andre, keeping his temper in check, simply nodded and walked toward the industrial sink. He had dealt with people like Richard before, men who hid their insecurities behind arrogance, who feared what they didn't understand. He could play the long game, for now. As he scrubbed dishes, Andre kept his head down but his eyes sharp. He watched everything. The way the head chef, Pierre, commanded the kitchen, the sous chefs moving around, plating dishes with mechanical precision. But what struck Andre the most was the mistakes, the things they thought no one noticed. The duck was overcooked. The béarnaise sauce had broken, its butter separating into an oily mess. A rich red wine reduction had been ruined by too much salt. These weren't small mistakes, they were basic errors in a kitchen that prided itself on perfection. Andre tightened his grip on the sponge, biting his tongue. He could fix every single one of these mistakes in minutes, but Richard had made sure he wouldn't get the chance. "Hey, dishwasher!" One of the younger chefs, Lucas, called out as he slid a cutting board toward Andre. "Think you can handle chopping some onions?" Andre glanced at the board and the dull knife beside it. The request was innocent enough, but he could sense the curiosity behind it. They wanted to see if he was all talk. He rolled up his sleeves and took the knife. With smooth, practiced motions, he began dicing the onions, perfectly even cuts, quick and effortless. The rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk of the knife against the board silenced the chatter in the kitchen. Lucas, watching from the side, raised an eyebrow. "Damn, that's some serious knife work." Pierre, the head chef who had been too busy overseeing dishes to pay much attention before, now turned his head. He stepped forward, inspecting Andre's work. Every single piece was identical, not a single mistake. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Pierre asked, his tone more serious now. Andre simply shrugged, wiping the blade clean. "Lots of practice." The tension in the room shifted. Whispers passed between the other chefs. They had seen enough cooks to know that no random dishwasher could move a knife like that. Andre wasn't just good, he was better than any of them. Richard, sensing that something was happening, stormed over. "What's going on here?" His gaze landed on the cutting board, on the perfectly diced onions. His eyes flicked to Andre, narrowing. Andre simply stepped back, going back to washing dishes as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The staff had seen him. They knew. And no matter how hard Richard tried to ignore it, something told him that this new hire wasn't just another dishwasher. Soon everyone would know exactly who Andre Simmons was. The kitchen was in chaos. Pans clattered, orders piled up, and the tension was thick enough to suffocate. The air smelled of butter, seared meat, and simmering wine reductions, but despite the luxurious scents, the atmosphere was anything but refined. Chefs scrambled, their faces damp with sweat, their hands moving in frantic motions. The energy was erratic, uncoordinated, something only an outsider could truly notice. Andre wasn't an outsider. He stood at the edge of the room, rolling up his sleeves, eyes scanning every corner of the kitchen. The disorganization, the inconsistency, it was painful to watch. Every misstep, every wrong cut of a knife, every poorly timed flip of a steak, he absorbed it all. He had been shoved to the back like an amateur, forced to wash dishes and chop vegetables as if he had never set foot in a fine dining kitchen before. It was a humiliation Richard Belmont had deliberately placed upon him. But Andre knew better than to let pride interfere with purpose. Now, as the rush reached its peak, he finally saw his opening. A young chef fumbled with a beurre blanc sauce on the stove, whisking desperately as the mixture began to curdle. His panic was visible. This wasn't just another sauce gone wrong. This was a mistake that could ruin an expensive dish, cost the restaurant its reputation, and, worst of all, place him in Richard's line of fire. Andre stepped in without hesitation. "Lower the heat," he instructed, his voice even, controlled. He reached for a splash of cold water, whisking it in with the kind of effortless motion that only came from experience. The sauce transformed, its texture smoothing into the creamy perfection it was meant to be. The young chef stared in stunned silence, his breathing still uneven from the panic that had gripped him moments before. "How did you—" he started, but Andre was already moving. Across the room, another chef pressed too hard on a Wagyu steak, squeezing out its precious juices instead of allowing them to seal inside. Andre gently pulled the spatula away, lifting the steak slightly. "Let it breathe," he murmured. "Meat tells you when it's ready. You just have to listen." The chef hesitated, then followed his lead. When he finally flipped the steak, his eyes widened at the perfect golden crust that had formed. By now, the kitchen had begun to take notice. It wasn't just his skill, it was the way he moved. He was calm, efficient, precise. His hands didn't shake, his commands weren't barked. He spoke only when necessary, but when he did, people listened. Even Richard, who had been watching from the other side of the room with a smug expression, began to realize something was shifting. "Andre," he called out, his tone laced with forced amusement. "Since you seem to think you know what you're doing, why don't we put you to the test? We have VIP guests coming in. Let's see if you can handle the line." There was a glint in Richard's eye as if he expected Andre to hesitate, to falter under the pressure. But Andre simply wiped his hands on a towel, tightened his apron, and stepped into position. "Let's find out," he said. The first orders came in quickly: duck confit, pan-seared scallops, filet mignon with truffle butter. The kind of dishes that required flawless execution. There was no room for error. "2 duck confits, plating in 5, Andre called out, his voice cutting through the noise like a conductor leading an orchestra. "Yes, chef." The response was immediate. The rest of the kitchen, once doubtful, now followed his lead without question. Andre moved with calculated speed, flipping steaks, searing scallops, spooning delicate sauces onto pristine plates. The way he plated the food wasn't rushed, it was artful. Every drizzle, every garnish, every placement of a sprig of rosemary was intentional. His knives danced, slicing through ingredients with an ease that left the junior chefs in awe. At one station, Lucas, a nervous sous chef, struggled to julienne a pile of carrots. His hands trembled, his cuts uneven. Andre took the knife from him, demonstrating with a speed and precision that made Lucas take a step back in shock. The carrots landed in perfect matchsticks, uniform and clean. The kitchen watched in stunned silence. Even Pierre, the head chef, who had initially dismissed Andre as just another line cook, found himself leaning in, watching closely. By the time the first plates were sent out, there was no denying it. The food leaving the kitchen that night was on a different level. Better, sharper, flawless. Richard, standing near the doorway, arms crossed, tried to mask his growing unease. But deep inside, his stomach churned. He had planned to humiliate Andre, to remind him of his place. But now, watching as the entire kitchen moved under his command, he realized something terrible. Andre wasn't just some chef. He was the chef, and soon the whole world was going to know it. The dining room of La Belle Cuisine radiated luxury. Soft candlelight flickered over pristine white tablecloths, crystal glasses gleamed under the golden glow of chandeliers, and a quiet hum of polite conversation filled the air. The restaurant was at full capacity tonight, hosting a crowd of elite guests, CEOs, celebrities, and most notably, Anton Leclerc, one of the most feared and respected food critics in the world. The waitstaff moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra, carrying out dishes with precision. Tonight's menu had been planned by the restaurant's executive chefs, but the food on those plates did not come from their hands. Every dish, from the perfectly seared filet mignon to the delicately arranged duck confit, had been crafted by Andre Simmons, and the guests had no idea. The moment the first bites were taken, a wave of silence rolled across the room. Forks paused midair. Eyes widened. Murmurs of appreciation began to spread like wildfire. Soft gasps followed by stunned expressions. One woman dabbed her lips with a napkin and leaned toward her husband. This is beyond perfection," she whispered, her voice almost reverent. At another table, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair chewed slowly, his brows furrowing in deep concentration before he finally spoke. I've eaten at three-star Michelin restaurants across the globe, but this is different. There's something about it. But the most telling reaction came from Anton Leclerc. Seated at his usual table, the renowned critic had taken one bite of his filet mignon and then stopped. His knife and fork hovered over the plate as if he were trying to understand what had just happened. He took another bite, then another, his expression unreadable. Then he set his utensils down. His dining companion, an equally well-known journalist, glanced at him curiously. Something wrong? Leclerc didn't respond immediately. He simply reached for his wine glass, took a measured sip, then exhaled. His gaze slowly lifted, scanning the dining room. Finally, he spoke, his deep French accent cutting through the air. I need to meet the chef. The restaurant fell into utter silence. Guests turned their heads, their interest piqued. Servers hesitated in their steps. Even the pianist in the corner faltered on a note before continuing softly. Behind the bar, Richard Belmont stiffened. He had been monitoring the reactions all evening, watching as the guests raved about the food. But now he felt panic creeping in. Leclerc wasn't just a critic, he was the critic. A single review from him could either catapult a restaurant into stardom or bury it beneath crushing scrutiny. And he wasn't asking, he was demanding. The maître d', an older man with years of experience, stepped forward cautiously. Mr. Leclerc, our executive chef, is of course honored by your request, but Leclerc held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. His eyes remained locked onto the staff at the front of the restaurant. I did not ask for the executive chef, he said, his tone sharp. I asked for the chef who made this meal. More whispers rippled through the restaurant. The guests who had been enjoying their meals now leaned in, intrigued. Richard's jaw clenched. This was not the plan. He had spent the past few weeks treating Andre as nothing more than a kitchen hand, keeping him in the shadows. If the guests found out who was responsible for the food tonight, if they realized that the very man Richard had mocked and degraded was the true mastermind behind these dishes, it would ruin everything. For a brief moment he considered lying. Maybe he could claim that one of the executive chefs had prepared the meal, steer the attention away from Andre. But before he could open his mouth, a deep, confident voice cut through the silence. No need to look any further, Mr. Leclerc. The room turned. Andre Simmons stepped forward. Dressed in a pristine white chef's jacket, his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the scars of years spent in the heat of the kitchen, he walked with the presence of a man who knew exactly who he was. He didn't need validation, but he had earned it. And now he was claiming it. Leclerc's gaze settled on him, sharp and assessing. Then something flickered in his expression, recognition. Richard's stomach dropped, and in that moment he realized the truth was about to come out. The kitchen doors swung open and Andre stepped into the dining area, wiping his hands on his apron. The clatter of silverware and quiet murmurs of conversation instantly ceased as all eyes turned toward him. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze in time, every guest now staring in disbelief at the man emerging from the back. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a voice, soft at first but rising with excitement, broke the silence. No way. That's Andre Simmons. The ripple effect was instant. Heads whipped around, eyes widened, and hushed whispers spread like wildfire throughout the room. Several guests stood craning their necks to get a better look. Others pulled out their phones, scrolling through their screens, confirming what their eyes refused to believe. A wealthy businessman near the front gasped, nudging his wife. Is this a joke? The Andre Simmons, the Michelin-starred chef, here? At the center of the chaos, Richard Belmont stood frozen, his face rapidly draining of color. His once smug expression had collapsed into sheer horror. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He couldn't breathe. Then another figure emerged from the crowd, Anton Leclerc, the world-renowned food critic. Unlike Richard, his face was beaming with excitement. He rushed forward, seizing Andre's hand in a firm handshake. My God, man, I have followed your career for years. Your Parisian bistro, a masterpiece. Your Tokyo fusion restaurant, genius. But what on earth are you doing here? Andre chuckled, his grip steady but deliberate. He let the moment settle, relishing the shift in power. Then slowly he turned toward Richard, whose hands trembled at his sides. You're the Andre Simmons, Richard stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Andre smirked slightly. That's right, world-renowned chef, Michelin-starred, the man who trained under culinary legends, the man whose recipes have been featured in the most prestigious restaurants across the globe. His voice lowered, but everyone in the room could still hear the edge in his tone. And the man you forced to wash dishes. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Some guests turned to Richard with glares of disgust, while others shook their heads, whispering among themselves. Richard stumbled backward, his entire body rigid with pure humiliation. I had no idea, he stuttered, his once confident persona now crumbling into a pathetic excuse for an apology. Andre crossed his arms. No? You mean you didn't recognize me when you mocked me on my first day, or when you refused to let me step into the kitchen, or when you laughed in my face and told me I didn't belong? His voice was calm, but each word cut like a knife. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Leclerc turned sharply to Richard, his eyes blazing with anger. You insulted one of the greatest chefs of our time? You treated Andre Simmons like a nobody in your own restaurant? He let out a harsh laugh, shaking his head in pure disbelief. Richard's lips trembled, his mind scrambling for a way out. I didn't mean, you were just a fool, Andre cut in, his voice now deadly cold. The room exploded into whispers once again. Guests pulled out their phones, recording the moment, capturing Richard's downfall in real time. The kitchen staff, many of whom had been forced to watch Richard's arrogance for years, exchanged satisfied looks, some even smirking behind their hands. Then Andre took a deep breath and turned to the dining guests. I apologize for the deception, he announced, his voice strong and unwavering. I came here under a different name because I wanted to see firsthand how this restaurant was being run. He shot a sharp glance at Richard, who looked on the verge of collapse. And what I found was unacceptable. The guests nodded in agreement, murmuring amongst themselves. Many of them were high-profile individuals, people who had the power to make or break a restaurant. Leclerc crossed his arms. I was ready to write a glowing review based on the meal alone, but now I have a far more interesting story to tell. His eyes gleamed with something dangerous. Richard's knees nearly buckled. Andre stepped forward, lowering his voice so that only Richard could hear. You wanted to treat me like a nobody? He murmured. Well, now everyone knows exactly who you are. The weight of those words landed like a death sentence. Richard swallowed hard, his legacy crumbling around him. And in that moment, he realized there was no coming back from this. Word spread like wildfire. Within minutes, social media was flooded with videos of the shocking reveal. Every post, every tweet, and every story carried the same message. Something unprecedented had happened at Richard's restaurant. The clips captured the look on Andre Simmons' face as he confidently declared his final decision. In kitchens and living rooms alike, viewers marveled at his unapologetic defiance and culinary mastery. Inside the restaurant that fateful evening, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Guests who had come for a routine meal now found themselves thrust into a dramatic spectacle. Their phones out, they recorded every moment, capturing Andre's defiant smirk as he addressed Richard in a tone that mixed resignation with liberation. I quit. Not that you ever gave me a real job anyway, he had said, his voice echoing across the room like a death knell for Richard's reign. Almost immediately, the reaction was overwhelming. Guests started demanding interviews with Andre, showering him with praise for his cooking and his bold stand against mismanagement. This is more than just great food, one guest exclaimed. This is the taste of freedom and integrity. The energy was palpable, and the restaurant buzzed with conversations about ethics, respect, and the true value of talent. Among the throng, a VIP guest, impeccably dressed and carrying an air of authority, turned to Richard with thinly veiled contempt. "You don't deserve a chef of his caliber," the guest said, each word dripping with disapproval. Richard's face turned a deep shade of red as he tried to muster a response, but his words faltered under the weight of public opinion. Then, adding further insult to injury, a renowned food critic, who had been silently observing the unfolding drama, nodded gravely and remarked, "With Andre Simmons in the kitchen, this restaurant could actually earn a Michelin star, but with an owner like you, it'll never happen." The critic's words resonated with